Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Leanne, and I will be your host for today. Thank you to all of the teachers and students joining us from the live stream and from YouTube. We have a great event planned for you all this afternoon, and our guest joining us is Jut Wynne. Jut Wynne is a cave scientist and conservation ecologist. He has traveled around the world to places including China, Spain, and Hawaii. His work involves learning about undiscovered species in caves and regions across the globe. He is furthering remote sensing detection capabilities of caves in the thermal, infrared, and visible spectrum, and collaborating with NASA researchers to improve robotic and human exploration of extraterrestrial caves. We are so excited to have Jut join us today to share some of his awesome research with us. Jut, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Leanne. Thanks for having me.
All right, so I'm just going to add you right in there, and you can become, oh.
Whoa.
Sorry about that. Can you, if you want to just pull up your, pull your PowerPoint. Perfect, okay.
All right.
And then once you make it full screen, everything should be good to go.
All right, so I'm going to speak with you all today about some of the variables that influence cave biological diversity. And this is going to be a short talk, so obviously we're just going to skim the surface in terms of what some of those drivers actually are. But first, before we can get into this, we need to understand what is a species. Now, there are a myriad of different definitions for species, but the one that we're going to go with is the biological species concept. And basically that is a species is a group of organisms that can reproduce from one generation to the next. And by extension, because of that, they become a biodiversity unit, right? They become one of those species within a community of organisms, which collectively is biological diversity. So in terms of cave evolutionary biology, once again, this is a vast topic, but so what I want to do is just kind of, once again, skim the surface here. And some of the things that we want to talk about is just kind of showing you the different ways in which animals can enter caves and ultimately become adapted to the cave environment. Here's an example where a surface population goes extinct. But it goes extinct after some of the individuals from that population have colonized the cave. And then over evolutionary time, this population here becomes adapted to the cave environment. Here's an example where there is continued exchange between the populations, but you ultimately see adaptation to the cave environment. Here's another example where you have a surface dwelling species and then an intermediary group. And you see interbreeding going on across these three different species groups. So that's just a few examples. Once again, there are several here. Really, the reason why I wanted to show this particular graph is just to illustrate how complex evolutionary biology underground truly is. And this is actually a graphic that I created for a book that we will be getting published here within the next probably 6 months or so. So if this is something that interests you, you will be able to get that book on Amazon in the near future. So when it comes to what really spurs the evolution of animals underground, it's that, let's see, boy. That's okay. It's the environment. The environment selects. So what we have here is along this gradient at the bottom of this slide here, you have climatic stability. So at the entrance, you would expect that climatic stability would be low because basically you're going to see that variation associated with the seasons, the rising and the setting of the sun. And at the deepest part of the cave, what we call the cave deep zone, you're going to have high climatic stability because there's not going to be a lot of variation in the climate. It's going to be a relatively stable temperature. You're going to see low to no airflow. And it's most likely going to be, if you have deep zone conditions, it's going to be very humid, almost 100% humidity in the deepest part of the cave. And in terms of how animals ultimately evolve to subterranean ecosystems, once again, at the entrance, you're going to see low specialization. You're going to see animals that are not tightly linked, if you will, to the cave environment. Whereas when you go to the back of the cave, that's when things get really interesting. That's where you have a high degree of specialization for the cave environment. So what exactly do I mean by cave specialization? So this is an example of a troglophile. Now, troglophiles are animals that can complete their life cycle underground, but can also be found in similar cave-like habitats on the surface, for example, within a hollow log or underneath rocks, or maybe even in a talus slope along a hillside. Our second group are what we call subterranean-adapted animals. And this is where, to me at least, this is where things get really cool and interesting. Our first group is called a troglobiont. Now, this is just a fancy term that we use in cave biology to refer to an animal that is adapted to the subterranean environment. What you see, some of the classic, and this is a classic example here of subterranean adaptation. You have this animal is eyeless. It has elongated antenna. Legs are long and slender. Clearly, you can see it's depigmented. And if we could zoom in and we're able to see its legs, and along the length of its body, you could see that it's covered in hair or setae. And this becomes, if you will, its eyes underground. It helps it to navigate the underground environment in complete darkness. The other counterpart to a troglobiont is a stegobiont. Now, a stegobiont is just simply the aquatic counterpart to the troglobiont. So these are subterranean adapted animals that occur in water. Now, here's a couple of examples in terms of how animals will colonize caves, ultimately become isolated, and evolve into subterranean adapted forms. This is an example that a colleague of mine presented way back in 1968. What he was stating is that here's a surface population. You have individuals colonizing caves in different locations that may be spread apart geographically. The surface population goes extinct. And then what you see here is these different species evolving, and they evolve as subterranean adapted forms. Now, this is something really neat. What we have here is we have an example where a surface-dwelling species colonizes a cave, and over evolutionary time, it becomes adapted to the cave environment. And because there are these cracks and crevices and nooks and crannies within the caves, or underground, that actually connect the different caves, we call them mesocaverns. And what can happen is these animals can actually disperse through the cracks and crevices in the rock. And you can see here in this particular case, you have this animal that's able to become cave adapted here in this location. It then is able to travel into the next location, and then into the next, and so on and so forth. And it can expand its range, the place in which it occurs, over a larger area. So in terms of general drivers of diversity, I'm going to discuss three here today. The first one is a really neat one called the latitudinal diversity gradient. And what this examines is it examines how diversity increases as you go from more temperate regions to the equator, and how it decreases as you go from the temperate regions further north or further south towards the poles. And essentially why we have a higher diversity of species along the equator is the idea, the conventional wisdom being, is that over evolutionary time and over geologic history of the Earth, that the equatorial region was not subjected to the glacial interglacial periods during the Pleistocene and before. So this was a more stable climate over time, and as a result, that gave rise to a higher diversity of life. The next is we call habitat heterogeneity, and that's just a fancy way of saying how different is that habitat? How many different types of habitat are packed within a given area? And you could see in the tropics, you would think that, okay, it's all tropical forest, but within that, there's going to be a lot of little tiny different microhabitats. And that gives rise to animals being able, and plants being able to diverge and have a higher diversity. And when we think about drivers, you can think about drivers in terms of what boosts or increases biological diversity, and also things that can result in a decrease in biological diversity. There are, we would think of other examples in addition to human activities as being major disturbances, a major storm moving through an area. That can take a whack at the diversity of a given area. Now, that's a short-term effect. And here, when we're talking about human activities, unfortunately, this is a much longer-term impact to a permanent impact. So first, let's look at the latitudinal diversity gradient. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide an example here of two different cave systems, one from the Greater Grand Canyon region and another from Belize. And my goodness, when you just look at the difference here of this map, you can see that, Grand Canyon, it's kind of tannish, brownish. That's kind of, the way that the cartographers developed this map is that's to suggest, well, that's not as lush in terms of vegetation as, my goodness, it is down in this part of the world. Very green, not so green. So that should tell us something right there from the outset. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the diversity of arthropods by taxonomic group. And what we're looking at is, family to order of the different groups of species. And this is for Grand Canyon Parashant National Monument. You can see here that we're looking at the diversity of 6 different caves, and we have 13 different taxonomic groups represented. Now, when we look at what we have at Runaway Creek Nature Reserve in Belize, Central America, 4 caves, so we have fewer caves, and 22 different groups. So we almost double the number of species when we go from looking at caves in the Grand Canyon region to down in tropical Central America. Something else important to note is that we sampled more caves, yet had fewer species. So that should tell you something too. That's like, wow, okay, they actually sampled more caves and still had fewer species when compared to the tropics. In terms of looking at the diversity here, we had at least 44 different species from Grand Canyon Parashant, the Greater Grand Canyon region, and 64 different species. When we look at diversity of the subterranean-adapted animals, 7 for Parashant, more than double for Belize. So that just gives you, this is a great way to illustrate, in my opinion, the difference by going from north to the center of Earth in terms of latitudinally. And these are the things, once again, to emphasize just the pronounced difference in species and subterranean adapted animals, and then, of course, the pronounced difference in latitude. So this is a more comprehensive diagram of the global drivers of biological diversity. And, the things that we want to capitalize on here, obviously, are these different variables looking at temperature, productivity, and that would be of the surface, what drives what could occur underground. But when we go underground, we look at nutrients and some of the other aspects here where we get into that aspect of habitat heterogeneity. How long is the cave? What are the different conditions within the cave? And those are the sort of things that we can view in terms of this notion of how different are those individual habitats available within a given cave. And I'm going to look at this more from we're going to zoom out, and I'm going to look at this more from the perspective of different types of habitat, which can contribute in part to the diversity of a given cave system. One of the most important things that we've experienced thus far in my research over the past 20 years is this notion of relic plant communities that, for whatever reason, be it a climatic shift associated with the last ice age or human activities, these plant communities, as you can see here, these are moss gardens in the entrance of a cave. They're now stuck in that part of the cave, and they don't occur on the surface any longer. And because of that, we can actually find relict animal communities as well. Here's another example. These are moss fern gardens from Easter Island. And we found relict arthropod species here as well. And these are relict plant communities from southern China. And in this particular case, this is due to human activities. There was since the 1940s, 50s, there has been an intensive effort to harvest timber in this part of China. And as a result, a lot of these plants are now restricted to the cave entrances. And with that, we're finding that there are also relict animal species, in this case, arthropods or insects, that are occurring within the entrances of these caves. Another aspect that can make the habitat more variable in terms of an entire cave are the presence of bats. And in this particular case, this is a maternity roost of Mexican free-tailed bats in western New Mexico, and on the order of tens of thousands of bats. And you can, if you think about it, if there's a lot of bats, there's going to be a lot of poop. And the guano is a nutrient source. And what this can do, well, the guano plus dead bats, this can provide a boon for an entire community of animals that occur within the cave that start by feeding. You have primary consumers that are eating the fungi growing on the guano. In some cases, they're actually eating the guano. And then you have animals eating those animals. And then you have an entire community of animals that are dependent upon the presence of bats and the guano that they produce. Here's another neat example. These are root curtains. And this is an example from the Big Island of Hawai'i. And what we see here is this is in a relatively new lava flow. So what you see on the surface, there isn't a lot of vegetation. The vegetation that does exist is often stunted in stature. And then you get underground and you see that the rainforest actually exists underground. This is where everything is happening in terms of the productivity. You have these just amazing meters in length root curtains, and on them are insects. And in a lot of cases, these are insects that are adapted to the cave environment and that occur in these caves, and in most cases occur nowhere else on the entire planet. So that makes these type of habitats incredibly important. So let's shift to something not so savory. This is a major surface disturbance associated with human activities. I actually heard a piece this morning on NPR where they reported that Greenpeace China had reported that there was, in northern China, there was a surge in pollution that they identified as being associated with concrete and steel production in that part of the world. And you can see here, this is for concrete production. They will remove, when they want the raw material to make the concrete, they will remove entire hills. If there are caves within these hills, if there are systems that occur beneath these hills, they can be dramatically impacted. And as a result, we can lose that biological diversity. So let's look at the differences, though, just more generally between cave millipede diversity. And let's look at it, and we're going to compare southern China to the greater Grand Canyon region, which we discussed for the latitudinal gradient example. You can see here, this is Grand Canyon caves on the right, and then we have Guangxi caves, which are in southern China in a region known as the South China Karst. This is what it looks like. It's absolutely spectacular. It's one of the most amazing places that I've visited to date. The people, the culture, the food, the caves. This is the area that we were working. We were working in caves around the city of Guilin, and we sampled 4 caves in this region. And these were some of the critters that we found. And most of these were new species. You can see here that you'll see Lua and Wynne, and this is indicative of us describing this as a new species. So this is a new species. This is another new species. Oh, no, this one isn't. We thought this was a new species, but it turned out not to be. This is a new species. But really what I'd like to emphasize is just the amazing diversity. Just look at how different these millipedes are. Absolutely spectacular. And this is my favorite. And I showed this as in an earlier slide, but for a good reason, because it's my favorite. And now let's look at the greater Grand Canyon region. We sampled 17 caves, and this was over a longer period. The example I showed you earlier was from a smaller portion of that study. So we looked at 17 caves over the past, 10, 15 years. And this is what we found. 1 species. So when we look at it and in comparison, we had 9 different species from 4 caves. 6 of them were new species. 4 of them were subterranean adapted. We had, and this is in, and then we have Grand Canyon. We had 1 species, 4 caves, and 1 of which was cave restricted. Now, there were a lot of differences when we looked at the diversity in terms of what the drivers were. But the question is, what is it? Is it the latitudinal gradient, or is it habitat heterogeneity? So in conclusion, what I would like to emphasize here is that when we look at biological diversity, there are a lot of different factors that affect the biological diversity and that drive biological diversity on this planet. And those are things that, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very complicated recipe in terms of what all goes into it. And I hope I was able to provide at least 2 really good examples to show you all what the differences were, or what some of those drivers were that drive differences in biological diversity. But this is the thing that is most important here that we have to think about moving forward. The factors that we create that negatively affect biological diversity. Now, this is something that I didn't discuss earlier because I wanted to emphasize it here. These are the factors that feed into biological diversity in green. These over here are the ones that detract from biological diversity of caves. Most of these are us. Invasive alien species, we're the ones that move them around all over the world, and as a result, they can wreak havoc on native populations of animals in caves. Pollution, that's another thing. The removal of an entire mountain, that's no bueno. That's not good for any animals that occur within caves or down further below the surface. So we really need to think about this moving forward. What are our impacts on biological diversity? And really, that's why I'm here, because I want to help you all understand and make you all excited about protecting what is left, because you all are the next generation. And moving forward, by you all having this information and being able to share it with your folks, the long-term goals is that, we all collectively become more educated on this issue of protecting biological diversity globally, and we can help influence people who make decisions so that we can protect what is left on planet Earth. And with that, I am more than happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Jet. That was a great presentation. And I think that gave us a really good insight into what biodiversity entails and how we, as the next generation, can really keep the environment preserved. So thank you for that presentation. We are going to start with the question and answer. So for any of the classes on with us, the live stream, that want to turn their camera on or that have a camera, we're going to start with if Mr. Zangoli's class is still here, they want to turn the camera on, they can ask the first question. Okay, let me just.
Hi there, Jet. That was awesome. Like lots of interesting information and questions that we have. Caleb, you had one, bud?
Have you ever encountered any cavemen?
One right there. Perfect.
Right here. You're talking to one.
We had a couple of other questions.
No, but actually, just to provide a little more depth on my question, pun intended, we have found animal remains. So whether or not, but they weren't back to the caveman era, if you will. They weren't Neanderthals or early hominins, but they were. We knew that folks were using caves.
Emily, you had a question?
Yeah.
You want to go on up there and go like right in front of the camera, hon? Or no? Okay, Emily has a question. What is it, hon?
What got you into cave exploration?
I don't know if you can hear.
Yeah, I can, that's such an awesome question. Thanks for asking that, Emily. So yeah, bats. That's what got me into wanting to study caves. I developed a fascination for bats while I was pursuing some graduate work in Europe, and that evolved into becoming interested in caves. Through my interest in bats, I was invited to go down to Belize to do what was initially a bat project, but it turned into a bat and everything else that occurred in the caves project. So yeah, short answer, bats.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to add our next group in, Mrs. Beavis's class. If they'd like to ask a question.
Joke in there.
Hello. Yeah. I've heard it before.
I know, that's why I didn't go there.
That's why we're all dressed up today. It's tourist day.
All right.
Okay, we have Rowan here who has a question. Come on, Rowan.
Do bears live in the same cave that bats live in?
That's a good question. I would say, let's unpack this. So bears are going in caves. Oftentimes, the ones that, and granted, I'm just going on what I've seen, right? I haven't actually encountered hibernating bears, but from what I've seen in terms of video footage, some of them are smaller passageways where that just kind of fits the bear. The bear can get within it. So if that's the case, and that is indeed what bears select for in terms of their hibernation habitat. We find bats on ceilings and sometimes on the walls in more open spaces. And those, so looking at it from that perspective, probably not. And I would think that they're both probably selecting for colder caves so they can go into hibernation. So I would think probably that variable would be similar in that, they want a cold habitat for hibernation. So yeah, the answer is I don't know. I would think maybe in some cases we would see bats and bears using the same cave, but I would expect they're probably going to be occurring in different parts of the cave.
All right, we actually have a kind of related question from Mr. Langel's class in Ontario, and they ask, do the new species only live in the caves that they are born in, or can they live in other ecological areas?
Good question. All right, so in terms of, okay, so I showed you that earlier graphic about the mesocaverns. And those are the cracks and crevices within the rock that can connect caves that are far apart. And how far apart? Well, that depends on how highly cracked and fractured that rock is, and how old that rock is in some cases. So the idea being is that conceivably, yes, you can have a population that evolves here into a subterranean adapted form. And because there are all these cracks and crevices in the rock, that you can have that same species disperse from this cave to this cave. So that does happen. And we've actually been able to show that, not me personally, but my colleagues have been able to demonstrate that using genetic techniques. So looking at the genetics, looking at the DNA of these animals and saying, okay, well, we have these two populations. Are they similar? Or are they the same species, or are they different species? And that can be demonstrated now with genetic techniques. So yes, the answer to that question is yes.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to bring in Mr. Charlin's class, also from Ontario.
Hey
Ask
guys.
a question.
Well, we're a virtual school, so it's just me. All of my kids are watching this stream online, and I've got a blast of questions here for you, Jet. So I'll just shoot you with one of my favorites. Have you ever been scared of anything when going into a cave? Animals, the darkness, what you might find? And that is from Rita.
Scared is, I would say, caves, well, it's an adrenaline rush. So I think as long as the adrenaline is going, you're probably really not thinking about being scared. I can say that I've had a close call in a cave, but it really turned out maybe it wasn't so close of a call. Here in northern Arizona, we have peccary, which are a native pig that occurs throughout this region, and they actually like to den in caves. And I knew that one of these caves had a den of peccary, or was a den for peccary. And I went into this cave, and I heard the pigs. They were making a lot of racket, and I didn't know exactly where they were. And by the time I figured it out, I was basically face to face with them. And so what I did was I just, there was a narrow place where they needed to get by, and I just made myself as skinny as I possibly could up against the wall. And I just stood there and I just talked to them very calmly. And they just kind of snorted and grunted and walked right by me and walked right out of the cave. So, and then of course I've almost been crushed by rock. I wouldn't say I was scared. I didn't have time to be scared. I was more concerned about getting out of the way. But yeah, fear doesn't really factor into what we do. It's more just being really careful and planning. If you're really careful underground and you plan for everything, you plan to be stuck in the cave, you plan to get injured underground. I have a full first aid kit that I carry with me. I'm medically trained. I have other folks on the team that have medical kits and are medically trained. So yeah, it's I guess we're just careful. So fear doesn't come into the equation.
All right, we're gonna answer a question from YouTube, and we have a student that's asking, how large are the caves that you are investigating?
Oh shoot, all shapes and sizes. Some of them are if you have to take off your helmet and turn your head sideways and exhale to get through a very skinny passage, to caves that you could drive a double-decker bus into. They span the gamut.
All right, so now we're going to bring in Miss Corkery's class. So if they want to ask their question, and I can unmute them.
If you discover a new species, what factors would go into naming it?
Oh, hey, that's a great question. It depends. So in terms of how do we name a species, it's in terms of the allocation, the naming of the animal. That's completely up to us. And by us, I mean the folks who discover the animal, and then the folks who actually go through the process of describing the animal. You can discover a species, and so I think we have probably 40, 50 species that we have formally described as new species. And by that, I mean we actually have written the papers, and they have ultimately been published on those species. But we probably have twice as many that we think are new. But we don't have, there's no one to describe them. They've been orphaned. But we have the ability to do so. And, typically what we'll do is, for my work, in terms of how I name species, I like to honor the places and people that I work with. So for Easter Island, we have several species that are named using Rapa Nui phrases, which is a Polynesian language that the Rapa Nui people speak. And then we also name them after folks that were influential or historical figures from that particular area. But yeah, it's pretty much up to us, the folks that are actually writing the paper to describe the animal, in terms of how we come up with the name.
And I'm sure you would agree that there are so many still species yet to be discovered as well. There's actually a question from YouTube asking, how many undiscovered species of arthropods do you think are still out there?
No idea. And for me to give a number, you could ask 5 other folks and you get 5 different numbers. What I can say is that there is an urgency for us to catalog the animals that occur underground, because we're probably looking at, unless we change our ways, we're looking at 2 to 3 decades more before things will be so drastically changed that we're going to lose scores of species before they're even formally described. And in terms of protecting biological diversity, when we think about the drive and the urgency of cataloging and identifying and describing those new species, we can also look at it through a separate lens, and that is, how can those animals help us? So do they provide ecological services, for example? Bats are a primary example. They provide ecological services because they are seed dispersers and pollinators in tropical parts of the world. They also consume millions of agricultural pests. So they basically, by their presence, the insectivorous bats enable us to use less pesticides in certain parts of the world. In terms of animals, it could be indicators for ecological health. So there are some animals that are incredibly sensitive to pollution, for example, and there are others not so much. But if you can identify those that are the indicators that can tell us when the health of a system is turning, that we could study those and monitor those and see how those populations change over time to tell us the health of our system. And if you think about it, what is it, 95% of the planet is reliant upon water that comes from the ground? That's a lot. That's most of us. That's almost all of us. And what is an aquifer but a cave filled with water? So, that's another way of looking at it, that these systems are worth protecting for many, many reasons. So we need to know the biological diversity to better do so.
protecting biodiversity, it's a great segue into the next question, which is from Cedarbrook Public School in Toronto, Ontario. And they're wondering if you know how species or if species go extinct inside the caves.
That is an awesome question. And the reason why is that in some cases, yes, and in some cases, no. So remember earlier, I was described that the mesocaverns, right? Those cracks and crevices in the rock. So the idea being is that in some cases, and actually we observed that here in northern Arizona, where I was working in dry caves, and it was really, it was a great monsoon, that the caves that we were working in were normally very dry, but that particular time of the year, there was water coming down the walls. The floors were wet in the deepest parts of the cave. And lo and behold, it was great habitat for subterranean-adapted animals. So we put baits there and to bait for insects. And what did we find? We found subterranean-adapted animals. And ever since, we've gone back to those same areas. We haven't found anything. But those areas have been dry. So what does that tell us? That tells us that when habitats change, when the cave habitat itself changes, does the animal go extinct or does it retreat back into those cracks and crevices? And sampling within those cracks and crevices is incredibly difficult to darn near impossible. So we don't know in some cases. In some cases, you can, for larger bodied animals, for example, subterranean adapted salamanders, if all of a sudden we no longer find them, we can say they're extinct until they're not. Because in some cases, there was a study that I saw, I think it was a small deer-like animal in India that hadn't been observed in like 70 years. And then all of a sudden they found it again. So in some cases, yes, extinction is permanent, but in some cases, what is it? Evidence of absence is evidence of absence is an absence of evidence. Or no, absence of evidence is an evidence of absence. So you can't say that just because you don't find something, it doesn't mean that it's not there, that it's definitively gone. It just means that, for whatever reason, we're not able to find it. We're not able to detect it.
I think the question that a lot of people are asking, it seems to be very popular, which is a great way to end off for today, is what got you interested into this field of research and in cave exploration, and how did you know that this is what you wanted to do when you were younger?
I didn't. Neil deGrasse Tyson stated that when he was 13, he knew he wanted to be an astronomer. That's wow. I think that's just amazing when somebody knows at that age that that's what they want to do with their life. Me, I had no idea. I can say that since I was a little kid, I was very curious about the natural world. I loved animals. I looked for animals. I used to bring my mom everything that I caught, from raccoons to birds to snakes to turtles, all sorts of stuff. Whatever I could, I could catch and bring home, I would do it. So yeah, I think really if you don't know what you want to do at a young age, it doesn't matter. Enjoy being young, right? But if you do, then you have a leg up in terms of charting your path. But yeah, I didn't. I fell into the latter category. I had or the former category. I had no idea. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I was younger. I just knew I liked nature.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jet, for being here today and sharing a little bit more about your journey and the adventures that you've been on. And I just wanted to take the time also to thank all of the classes who joined us through the live stream and through YouTube. And if you're interested in seeing any more of the events through Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, definitely check out our YouTube channel and the website. So thanks again, Jet, and take care, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.